right, you guys can have a seat. If this is your first time here, my name's Adam. I'm the lead pastor here. I don't know why I introduced myself. You all have watched online well before you showed up. Nobody does that anymore, so welcome in person, right? It'd be really weird to show up to a place without having watched it before. You know what else is cool? I don't know if you guys know this, but what was it, a month ago, I was sitting down with Lauren, our children's ministry director, and she was telling me about the nursery, specifically the 11 o'clock nursery. And she was like, hey, so there's like 20-ish babies in there. I'm like, come again? 20? I was like, well, how many can we fit? She's like, yeah, about that. And I'm like, wait a minute, we're at capacity, like we can't fit any more in there? And she's like, not really. I said, hey, you know there's this major-ish Christian holiday coming up called Easter. Like, we might want to have room for more. So we went through this whole process. If you're wondering, like, why did we just have promotion Sunday in our kids ministry when it's nowhere near the end of the school year? It was to make room, which is just really, really cool. So kicked them all along, and even Scott had to do a bunch of stuff today. So it's just, like I said, man, I sat down and had coffee with one of my buddies who's a pastor, and I was telling him about all the stuff that's happening here. And he got this really serious look on his face. He goes, hey, dude, that's really rare, man. Like you need to like really be thankful for what God is doing. So I'm trying to take that to heart. So enough about Mosaic. Starting a new series today called God in the Wild, and I'm really excited about it. To kind of introduce it, so if this is your first time, I just want to apologize. I do this thing where I complain about Christians sometimes. I might push it a little too far, so I apologize if I push it too far and you're like a little bit offended. I am a Christian, so I'm allowed to make fun of them. But we do this thing where we have these sayings that only make sense to us and don't make sense to anyone who's not a Christian, who hasn't gone to church their whole life. And I've given examples before in the past. One of the examples I've given is it became really popular, and maybe still is, to say the phrase, we're going to love on someone. That's what churches say, that, oh, we're just going to love on this person. And I always think like, okay, that's weird, man. Like, somebody who's not a Christian might hear that and go, I don't understand what all that entails, and I don't want that. So we just got to watch our phrasing on things. So I wanted to bring up two that are a little more old school, but they've kind of gone to the wayside. So if you grew up in church, you might be familiar with these ones. The first one is, have you ever heard Christians talk about being washed in the blood? Washed in the blood, we even sing about that. Now, I get it. There's some deep theological truth there, right? We believe that Jesus died for our sins, and we believe that he paid for our cleansing with his blood. That is a deep and important spiritual truth. But if you say that to somebody who's not a Christian, they're going to think you're a serial killer because they don't know any of that, right? Like, that's just a little bit weird. And then there's one more I just wanted to bring up. It's just one word, and this one was really popular when I was like younger and kind of in youth group. We use the word fellowship a lot in church, the word fellowship. And I just want to point out, you have never heard the word fellowship outside of church except for one place, Lord of the Rings, right? The fellowship of the ring. That's the only time you've ever heard it, because churches have a fellowship hall. They have fellowship time after church. I remember pastors saying, we're going to have a sweet time of fellowship, which made me a little uncomfortable. Didn't know what that meant either. Just weird things that we say. Can't tell if we're going to do small talk or take the ring to Mordor. But we do these things as Christians that maybe we don't realize. There's a little subculture where we all understand what we're saying, but maybe somebody from outside doesn't. So one of the things that we say, kind of a metaphor, is we talk about having a wilderness experience. Christians talk about this a lot. And I just want to clarify, because maybe if you don't come from a church background, if you're not a Christian, you might have no idea what that means. You might think we're going camping. So I want to point out what we mean when we say wilderness, because that's kind of the theme of this sermon series. When a Christian says they're having a wilderness experience, it means that they're in a place in their life where they're like uncomfortable. It's not a good place to be. They don't have the creature comforts that they normally would have, like in their, like on a soul level, like on an emotional level. Usually when you say you're having a wilderness experience, you feel a little lost. It's uncharted territory. You're not sure where you're supposed to go in your life. If you're in a wilderness experience, you feel like you have a lack. You don't feel like you have everything you need. You're more in not thriving, but you're surviving kind of a feel. Usually if you're in a wilderness place, you feel a little bit of danger. You don't feel safe. And then usually you feel lonely, right? Because the wilderness is not a populated place to be. You're going to feel a little lonely. And then maybe most importantly, your relationship with God probably switched the status to complicated, right? Your relationship with God, when it comes to a wilderness experience, it's complicated. I'm not going to say it's for sure distant, it's for sure bad, but it definitely becomes more complicated, your relationship with God, when you're having a wilderness experience in your life. And I just want to say, I think, term aside, maybe if you're not familiar with that term, we probably all have been in a place like this before, right? Where you feel uncomfortable, you feel like you're in uncharted territory, you feel lonely, you feel lost, you feel a lack in your life, you feel a little spiritually confused. That is the wilderness. So the reason this term is popular, it's actually a pretty consistent term used throughout the entire Bible. Actually, the term wilderness is used a ton. That's why Christians kind of took it and we use it, because it's actually really common in the Bible. Adam was created in the wilderness and then God put him in the garden. Moses ended up in the wilderness not once, but twice. The first time was his fault. The second time wasn't his fault. David ended up in the wilderness before becoming king. John the Baptist did his entire ministry in the wilderness, and Jesus spent a really pivotal 40 days in the wilderness. It's a huge theme that you find all throughout the Bible. So we're going to do a series here on your wilderness experience called God in the Wild. We're going to talk about it for 4 weeks. And you might think, I don't know, I always struggle. I hope you don't think, oh, that's a depressing subject to talk about for 4 weeks, dude. Couldn't we do it one? Can we get it all today? The reason I want to spend 4 weeks on it, though, is because wilderness is an interesting experience. So another metaphor we use is we talk about being in storms. Christians talk about that a lot. I'm just in a storm right now. Well, a storm is usually fast and violent, right? But a wilderness is usually long and tedious. So when we talk about having a wilderness experience, it's not going to be like a day or two, right? You don't have a wilderness experience in a day or two. That you just need to take a nap, right? That's not a wilderness experience. Usually you're talking extended periods of time, weeks, months, or even if God's really getting after you, it can last over a year or longer. So the reason I wanted to talk about wilderness for a couple of weeks is because I feel like you're going to spend a decent amount of your time in a wilderness experience. That there's often, we don't like to talk about it, but there is going to be a chunk of your life that you're going to spend in a wilderness type place. So I think it'd be silly for me to try and say everything in a week. I think we need to spend 4 weeks and really look at what it means to be in a wilderness and look at what God can do in that. And I'll also point out one more thing before we jump in. I'll own this. You can own it if you want, but I'll go first. My instinct when I'm in a wilderness place in my life is I want out of it. I want it to be over. I want to know where the oasis is. I want to know where the river is. I want to know where can I get to that's not this place anymore. So I'm always trying to shorten the amount of time there. I have an angstiness to me. I have a why are we here, God? I want to move on to whatever's next, God, kind of a feel. But I want to propose something. While the wilderness can be physically and emotionally like a barren place, it can be spiritually rich. Spiritually rich. God is always doing something in the wilderness season in your life. Always. The wilderness is never wasted when you're in a place like that. Even if it feels dry, if it feels like there's nothing, God is doing something. And he's not. And I think there's this tendency to feel like God's trying to break you, but I want you to know he's not trying to fracture you, he's trying to form you. And maybe There will be a little cracking, a little breaking in that forming. He's not trying to harm you, but to hone you. And yes, there's some pain involved in that. Kind of the image of a diamond being formed, pressure and time it takes for that to form. That's the kind of feel that a wilderness can have, that God is trying to do something that's going to take a while and take a little bit of pain, but he can't do it any other way. Can't do it any other way. So I guess what I'm suggesting, and maybe this is a little counterintuitive, I'm suggesting you shouldn't want to leave the wilderness until God's done. You shouldn't want to leave the wilderness until God's done the work he's set out to do, because the wilderness is God's forge to shape you into who he wants to shape you into. So we're going to look at 4 instances in the Bible where people are in the wilderness. We're going to see 4 ways that God moves in that. Today, we're looking at Exodus chapter 13. Exodus chapter 13. This story comes right after God delivers the people of Israel out of slavery and in Egypt. And if you're not familiar, it's a huge victory. Egypt is the most powerful country on the planet at the time. Israel had no business escaping, but God moved, and they're coming out of Egypt. And this story happens immediately after that. It's just 2 verses we're going to look at today. And if you grew up in church, you think you know the wilderness I'm going to talk about, but I'm actually not going to talk about that wilderness. It's a little bit different. This actually happens before that. If you're not a Christian, ignore that because you don't know what I'm talking about. Exodus chapter 13, just 2 verses, 17 and 18. When Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said, if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness towards the Red Sea. Thus the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. So much there in just 2 little verses. So if you did grow up in church, if you are a church kid like me, I have a question. At this point in the story, has Israel done anything wrong yet? Now, if you're trying to place yourself in the book, you're thinking it's the book of Exodus, so probably, right? They just did stuff wrong constantly throughout the entire book. But at this point in the story, we're really, really quickly after them coming out of Egypt. Like they just left. Like they still got mud underneath their fingernails from making bricks. Like they're that fresh out of Egypt. So believe it or not, Israel has not done anything like wrong in the story. They haven't made any mistakes yet in the story. That's a really important point. The first thing I want you to see about the wilderness is that the wilderness is not necessarily punishment. The wilderness is not necessarily punishment. And forgive me for talking to the church kids so much, but the church has kind of messed us up on this. So if you grew up in church, you have this tendency. I'm saying the wilderness is not necessarily punishment. The reason I have to say that is because you think it is. Because you grew up on the other wilderness story, right? The other wilderness story in the Bible is the one that happens about 16, 18 months after this one, where the people of Israel go up to the edge of the promised land. God says go in, and they say, no, we don't want to. They do the very thing, by the way, that God's trying to avoid having them do now. They do it, and then God says, okay, you get to wander the wilderness for 40 years, right? We're all very familiar with this, one of the most famous stories in the Bible. If you grew up in church, you even had a little flannel graph about that story, right? They go around in a circle for 40 years, and you're wondering, how did they not know their way, right? And it's like, well, they knew the way. They didn't want to go the way God wanted them to go. But we have this tendency to believe, because of that story, that if I'm in a wilderness, I did something wrong, right? I made a choice that God didn't want me to make, and that's why I'm here. I didn't go the way God wanted me to go, and now I'm in this wilderness. But I want to point out here, just in these 2 verses, that's not the reason they're in this wilderness. That's not. So let's have this is a crazy idea in this day and age, let's have a more nuanced approach to wilderness. I know everything's very black and white with us, but more nuanced approach to a wilderness experience. Maybe the reason you're in a wilderness isn't because you did something wrong. It might not be. And I also want to say about the other wilderness experience when God said, go into the promised land and take it, and they said no. It was very explicit, right? They knew they were supposed to do something and they didn't do it. A lot of times we have this, I wonder if I went the wrong way approach. And that's like not what the Bible says was the experience there. They knew exactly the direction they were supposed to go and they refused. So the wilderness is not necessarily punishment. And the cool part about these two little verses is that it actually tells us what God was thinking, right? God said that he took them to the wilderness because essentially they weren't ready for what was coming next, right? Wasn't that what he said? He said, hey, they might run into those Philistines and they might decide to turn back around and go back to slavery. So God was saying, hey, you guys aren't ready yet. So that's the second thing I want you to see about the wilderness experience. It's not necessarily punishment. The wilderness is preparation. The wilderness is preparation. God here is actually looking out for the people of Israel. He doesn't want to send them into a fight that they're not ready for yet. He doesn't want them to make a mistake that's going to cost them the promised land. Think about it, that's God's heart. God wants them to get where he is trying to get them to. Of course he does. He wants them to end up, it's called the promised land. It's a name. He's promising this land that he wants them in, but he's saying we can't go straight there because you're actually not ready for it yet. So the reason he sent them to the wilderness was to prepare them for what it was going to take to get what he wanted them to have. So essentially the wilderness it's a mercy. It's a grace from God to send them the long way around instead of that direct path. That's a mercy from God. Now, if you're in a wilderness place right now and you hear the pastor up here saying, oh, the wilderness is a grace from God. Okay, right? It does not feel that way, right? This actually really hurts. It's frustrating. It's confusing. I'm in this season where I feel like I don't have what I need. I'm in this season where I don't feel like I have a direction or a purpose. I have no idea what God is doing with me right now. And you're telling me it's the grace of God, right? It's so easy to say. But listen, you got to see something in these verses. There's a little detail. Throw up verse 18 again. So at the very end of verse 18, whoever's writing Exodus makes a little editorial note. He says, hey, thus the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. There's this sense that there's this almost bravado about it, that they left Egypt kind of, doing a little swag to it. They're walking and they're like, yeah, we just left the most powerful country in the world. They actually gave us stuff and made us leave because that's how powerful God is. So they're kind of strutting out of there. And whoever's writing it's looking at them going, man, they look like an army ready for battle. But then if you throw verse 17 back up, God says, hey, if I take them straight to Philistine territory, they might change their minds and return back to Egypt. So while the writer's observing that they looked ready, God's in heaven going, actually, you might not be. And the reason I want to point this out is because I think this happens in our life a lot, that we think we're ready for something, that we may even look ready for something, but God sees something that we don't see. God sees something inside of us that we aren't aware of, right? And my guess is if you could have went around and took a poll of the people of Israel as they're leaving Egypt, hey, if we run into a really tough Philistine army, will you turn back and go to Egypt? I bet none of them would be like, yeah, we're going back to slavery, totally. No way, they would have fought you, right? Let's do this. Point me in the army of whatever Philistine army we need to kick. Let's go. Let's go fight them. But God's in heaven going, yeah, actually, what you think you're ready for, what you may even look like you're ready for, you're not. And this is a really important, Christian truth. I think it's maybe more important than we even give it credit for. But that God knows you better than you know you, right? And I almost hesitate to say it because it's almost like the way our culture talks about identity and self so much, but it's definitely not something that's popular these days. But I just want to say, God knows you better than you know you. I mean, that makes sense though, right? At least logically, can we back up and say, if I believe that God created me and literally wrote my DNA, and both physical and spiritual, that he would know me better than I know me, right? And he would even know some of the stuff that's happening inside of here that I'm not aware of, right? When David talks about know me and know my anxious thoughts, he wants he's asking God to tell him about himself because he doesn't know himself as well as he knows God knows him. So I think this is really important because this is where the rub's going to come when you're in a wilderness experience, when you're in a place, especially when you've been there a while, and your soul kind of feels like it's shriveling up and you're trudging through this wilderness experience. You're going to want to fight with God. And I'll just say it the way you should say it, even though if you're a Christian, you probably won't say it this way because you know you're not allowed to say it this way. But the reason you're having a hard time in the wilderness is because you disagree with God. You disagree with him. Now, you wouldn't say that out loud because you know God's omniscient and he knows everything and you can't possibly be right and him be wrong because he's God. But in this instance, you're kind of like, I think you missed here. I'm not supposed to be here, God. I should be in the promise. I should be wherever this place, and you got me here. Maybe you got a lot going on, God. Like you don't think those thoughts, but for real, you do disagree with the almighty, all-knowing God of the universe. And you want to say, I'm not supposed to be here. But I just want to suggest that maybe your soul can settle a little bit if you at least start to acknowledge in your head, okay, God knows more than me. God knows more than me. God knows me better than I know me. And maybe he has a reason for this that I don't know. Maybe I'm not ready for that thing that I think I'm ready for. And what's even more frustrating, if I may add to this, is that where they were going is where God wanted them. And like, if you've ever been in a place like that in your life where you're like walking towards the thing that you know God wants you to, and then God turns you off to the side and you're like looking at it like, wait a minute, but why am I going left when I should be going straight? That even more adds to the frustration because if you're right that the place where you were going is where God wanted you to go, turning left really hurts. Really hurts. But the thing you have to tell yourself, I have to tell myself on these journeys is that God is not turning you off because he doesn't want you to get there. He's turning you off precisely because he does want you to get there, but he wants you to be ready for when you get there. And that's the thing that you almost have to coach yourself through. If God is turning me off, the thing that I want and I believe God wants me to have, I believe that's the life that he wants for me. If he's turning me off, it might be because I'm not ready for it yet. It might be because he wants to do some work in me. Now, I'll go first. I'll own this. When I became lead pastor 11 years ago, I thought I was ready. 27, I'm a genius at 27. You didn't laugh as much as first service at that. It's weird. It was supposed to be sarcastic. I thought so many things when I became lead pastor at 27. I thought the church would look like this a year in, not a decade in, okay? I did. I thought, all right, we're measuring in months, not years. Let's go, God, let's go, God, let's go. And it took a decade. And that pastor friend I was talking to this week, I was like, man, when you're a pastor, or really when you're leading anything, I think you can probably associate with this a little bit. I always wondered if God kept the church throttled because of me. Maybe if you've ever read any John Maxwell books, he calls it the law of the lid. The thing will not grow past the ability of the leader. I'm like, well, that sucks. I get my limits put on display constantly. Great. But always feeling like, man, God is holding it back on purpose. And now looking back, going, oh yeah, 27-year-old me was actually really an idiot. And 27-year-old me wasn't ready for what 38-year-old me is now experiencing. And then knowing that 27-year-old me would have caused me pain and you. So God saved us both by saying, go the long way, stupid. You need to take a lap because you're not ready for this. And I know that now. Now, if I could go back and talk to 27-year-old me, he'd still fight me. He would. Good for him. And I'm happy that some of his stubbornness is stuck with me. I still got a stubborn streak. But I have to realize, and then for me, I always do the thing, well, if that was true at 27, I hope that at 48, I'm thinking that this Adam is also an idiot. Because if I don't, that means I didn't grow any, right? Like I always have to hope that a decade later that I look back and go, man, that guy was an idiot. But I know that God took me the long way around. But listen, I just want you to know, one of the things I do, not as often as I want to now, I need to get back into it more, but I used to like every week, several times a week, like go on walks and pray for extended periods of time. And like those literal walks where I'm talking to God about this thing that I think that God's supposed to do in my life, and it's this calling, this dream. I didn't ask for the dream. You know, you ever been there with God? Like, I didn't ask for this to be in my heart. I don't even want that. Like, I don't want to want this, but I do want it. So I feel like you put that there. You ever have those conversations? I don't know if I'm the only weird one that I have, the like really deep philosophical conversation with God. Like, what'd you put this desire in my heart for if you're not going to give it to me? Why? Take the desire away if you're not. Why make me walk the long way around? Like those conversations, like I was pretty raw and real. Like, why am I walking all the way around this way? But here's what I've learned. And maybe you can take the lesson that took me a decade. Maybe you can take this and use it faster than it took me. But I've learned in the wilderness, there are some things that God had to do in my heart that he could only do in the wilderness. That it was the only place it would happen. That if God had just said, here you go, let's go the short route straight to the place where that I've laid on your heart, that I wouldn't have learned some things that I needed to learn. And the only place I could learn them was in a wilderness place. So, that's a crappy truth, isn't it? Oh, yay, there's only things I can learn when life sucks. Yep. So here I want to give you 3 things that I think God does in the wilderness. We'll have lots more here in the next couple weeks, but let's start with 3. 1, the wilderness gives time for thought patterns to change. Time for thought patterns to change. If you just look at this instance, the people of Israel had been in slavery for 400 years. 400 years. That is longer than the United States has existed. They were slaves. What kind of mentality do you think they had after being slaves for 400 years? Their thought patterns were kind of locked into a certain wavelength. So God sends them on the long way around to give time for those thought patterns to start to change, for them to not think like a slave anymore, but to think as if they are free. Because if you take the old thought patterns to a new place, you're going to ruin the new place, right? If they had taken that slave mentality into the promised land, they would have messed it up. So maybe that's what God's doing in your life right now. Hey, I can't find an opportunity in the career that I want to find it in. Maybe you're not ready yet. Maybe God is being merciful to you, saying, I'm not going to give you that opportunity yet because if I gave it to you, you'd mess it up. I need to keep working in your heart. I need to keep working in the way you think to prepare you for that thing that I do want you to have. Maybe you're like me. Maybe you have some dream that you're like, why did God even give me this dream if I haven't? Why am I so far away from it? Why do I even have this desire? I feel like he put it there. I'm nowhere near it. Maybe God's taking you in the long way around because he wants to change some of these wavelengths up here, because if you kept this mentality, this mindset that you have now there, you'd mess it up. So the long way around through the wilderness, it gives time for thought patterns to change. And man, sometimes patterns of thinking just take a while to change, right? It's a pattern for a reason. It's a rut in your mind that has been dug that it's going to take God a while to chisel it away and allow your brain to think a different way. So that's the first thing God does in the wilderness. It just takes time for your thought patterns to change. The second thing I know that God does in the wilderness is, listen carefully here, it increases gratitude for the destination. Because if I talk about gratitude when you're in the wilderness, and if somebody's in a wilderness place right now, you might come up here and try to punch me because you're like, I don't feel grateful. Is that the same rock I saw a year ago? Like, we're just wandering here and you're telling me I'm supposed to be grateful for that rock? Like, that's not how you feel in the wilderness. But what I'm saying is, when God sends you on the long way around through the wilderness, when he finally allows you into whatever the place is in your life that you've been longing for, your gratitude level will be higher for it than if he had taken you the short route. You grow in your appreciation for the thing when you have to fight for it, when you have to work for it, when you have to take the long way around. You know this if you have kids, right? Best, I don't know, I guess I'd say best example. I could pick any example with my kids. Our couch, we have several. Like they play on it, they jump on it, they try to spill things on it, they grind any cracker that you could think of into the fabric of the thing. They're not allowed to have milk in the living room anymore because you can't get the smell of milk out of anything, right? Like, do you really want to sit there and be like, what's that smell? Rotten milk, awesome. But you know what they've actually said, that confirmed it with my wife, they've actually said multiple times to us, like, well, because we try to, unless you're a better parent than me, I haven't figured it out yet. We try to have rules. We try. That's all I'll say. We try. There's certain things they're not supposed to take into the living room because there's carpet and couches and stuff. Stay in the kitchen and the dining room. There's no carpet and spill all you want. But they'll take stuff like milk. Milk is they're really not allowed to take milk in there, but they will argue with us about it. Like, well, and then we explain to them, like, milk, the smell doesn't come out. And you know what they'll say back? Well, why don't we just buy a new couch? Why didn't I think of that? We'll just buy a new couch. But that's their mentality, right? Because they don't appreciate. Like an adult would appreciate, like you could do the math for how many hours you had to work to buy the couch, right? I know how much of my life this cost me, so don't tell me I should just go buy a new one, right? Because they don't have a sense of how much it costs, so they don't have a gratitude for the thing. They don't have the right attitude about the thing. And I think that can happen in our lives too. If God just gives us the thing real fast, we don't have a gratitude for it. We don't understand what it's like to not have it. We don't remember what it's like to not have it. I worry about that with our church sometimes. You know how long it took us to get here? Being mobile for 5 years, you're in both services. You better laugh at my jokes, both services. If you're going to sit in both, you guys got to laugh. I looked expecting not to see him, and there he is again. Clyde was our setup guy, man. He would move all the stuff in and out every week, and I promise you, when Clyde walks into our building where he does not have to set up any of this stuff, he feels a deeper gratitude than me or you feel for that, right? And I hope that we can realize, even if you're newer to the church, you're not a kid, so you're not going to do that thing. You're like, oh, it's not a big deal. Like, you can see how long the road was to get to where we are now and have a sense of gratitude for how far God's brought us, even if you weren't a part of the journey. Because it's an amazing thing, and I want to foster that. So if you're in the wilderness, God may be digging some things up in your heart, getting you ready for gratitude for the destination. Third thing God does in the wilderness, I'll say it this way, it gives an opportunity for dependence on God. It gives opportunity for dependence on God. The wilderness gives us an opportunity for that. I'm going to say it that way, even though it doesn't feel that way, right? Because the long way through the wilderness causes us, even forces us in some ways to put our dependence on God, right? As we start to come to the realization that, day in, day out, I'm kind of trudging through this thing. You have to make some decisions in the wilderness. Because a lot of times I think what God is doing in the wilderness is he's cutting things away, right? He's pulling things out of your life that you used to find satisfaction in, that you used to get fulfillment out of. He's kind of pulling these things off. Or maybe he's leaving them, but you're not getting as much satisfaction out of them as you used to. And it starts to get to a place where if you walk in the wilderness long enough, you realize that the only thing left is God. And I think the lesson is supposed to be that he's enough. That even if I have to walk the rest of my life through this desert, if he's with me, I'm good. The problem is the things he's taking off in the wilderness, the things he's removing usually are things that we have come, the churchy way to say it is they've become idols. They've become more important than God. That you've come to rely on things. You've come to find your deepest satisfaction in things that aren't him. So he sends you into the wilderness because he's going to strip all that away. You're not, you're relying on that? Well, you're not going to have that anymore. Oh, you're finding satisfaction in that? You need to pull that away. You find that more important than me, you're going to lose it. And he's going to strip away all these things. Even the dream. That was probably our biggest, for me personally, when I went through, the wilderness, my biggest conversations with God were, okay, you put this dream in my heart, it's important, but it's not more important than you. I think, at least for me, the dream is the easiest thing for me to make an idol. That dream that God gave me, that this is supposed to be a thing, and it's really easy for me because it's a spiritual dream, because it's a church thing, right? So I'm like, God, it's church. How can I possibly make church an idol? He's like that. That's what you're doing right now. And he's going to have to pull those things off or allow them to die down to a level where you're not making it more important than him. Dependence on him is supposed to grow in the wilderness. And what if dependence on God is one of those things that only grows in the wilderness? Like what if, and maybe some of you are different, maybe you're naturally gifted in a tendency to rely on God. Good for you, you can preach next week, because that is not my natural tendency. But it seems to me, for the rest of us, that the long way around through the wilderness is probably the place where dependence on him is supposed to grow. That is the fertile soil where dependence on God grows. And then let me build on that. What if wilderness is the only good place where dependence on God grows? And what if he can't give you the promised land without being dependent on him? So what if they have to be sequential? You can't get there if you don't have dependence, but you got to get dependence, so you got to go the long way around. Because if you're not dependent on God and he gives you the very deepest desires of your heart, you're going to ruin them. You're going to ruin them. Some of you could come up here and testify about the things that you have gotten in your life and you didn't have dependence on God, and you ruined them because you weren't ready for him yet. You weren't in the right spiritual place to accept those things yet. The wilderness is preparation. It's preparation. You need to have that dependence on God. Need it. All right, I will tell you this though. Slightly discouraging, but you need to know it. The wilderness is preparation, but you can sabotage your preparation. You can sabotage your preparation. I think the way that happens is by constantly complaining about the wilderness. Desperately wanting to get out of the wilderness, only focusing on wanting to get out of the wilderness. I guess I want to ask the question, what if your attitude about the wilderness taking so long is the reason it's taking so long? And that's the thing that needs to shift. What's your heart like? Let me end with this. I want to share something I learned this week. It actually blew my mind. Forgive me if this sounds cocky. I usually don't have my mind blown every time I'm doing research for stuff, but I was thrown off. I got so excited. I get giddy, like a little girl. I get so excited when I learn something like this because I get to share it with you. I'm assuming you don't know it. Maybe you do. When I saw this, I thought it was a mistake. I thought the concordance that I was looking at was wrong. That's I was going to argue with these Bible scholars. So I'm like, this can't be real. So the Hebrew word for the word wilderness in the Bible is this word midbar. Midbar. That's what the Old Testament was written in. So every time you see the word midbar, it's usually translated wilderness. So I do all this. I am not at all systematic in my research. I'm kind of a brainstorm. I will just read everything and anything that I can get my hands on. So I'm reading all this wilderness stuff. And if you jump into the concordance and if you look up the word midbar, The one I use, there's a little guy that he'll pronounce it for you. So I always listen to that to try and pronounce it right, and then I forget and I say it however I want, and you guys don't know the difference because you don't know how to pronounce them either. So there's that, and there's a couple other things, and then there's like, just like a dictionary, you can look up all the different definitions of the word. So in the concordance, it's the same thing for the Hebrew word. And at the top, of course, midbar is wilderness. That's the first one. And then you go down the line, there's like a bunch of them, and then I got to the bottom one, and I was like, the bottom definition of the word midbar is to speak. And I was like, that's weird. What does wilderness and speak have to do with each other at all? We're talking about, rocks and sand and scrub brush blowing through the wilderness and speaking. Like those two things don't have anything to do with each other. And like legit, I vividly remember like reading that and going, that's weird. Putting it down, like getting up and walking around because I'm pace all the time. And I was like, I don't, too much information, but I think I went to the bathroom and then came back. And then I was like, what? Why would that be? And then I realized, like, if you start thinking about all the different times people are in the wilderness, almost 100% of the time when someone ends up in the wilderness in the Bible, God speaks. That's like his favorite place to do it, actually. I mean, Moses is in the wilderness watching sheep, not doing anything that he thinks God called him to do in his life. His dream is dead, and all of a sudden there's a bush burning, and God's going to speak to him. Jacob is running for his life at Bethel using a rock for a pillow, nothing like what he thought his life was going to be. And boom, the heavens open up and angels are coming down, and he's experiencing God's presence in a way he's never experienced it before. Elijah, same thing. I mean, there's a consistent theme here. Elijah is depressed to the point where he's like, I'm done with this. Just kill me and get it over with, God. And he's up on a mountain, and God shows up and starts whispering to him. Because you can only whisper when you're close. People of Israel get a totally different experience at Mount Sinai where God booms to them. David wrote half the Psalms out in the woods somewhere. Jesus consistently went away to the wilderness to pray. The wilderness is where God speaks. So what if our mentality shifted? I know, man, I'm with you. I want to shorten this time. I don't want to walk the long way around. I don't want to be in the wilderness anymore. But maybe instead of the question, how can I make this shorter? Maybe the question should be, how can I listen better? How can I hear what you're trying to tell me right now, Lord? Because it's this place. I think it's the wilderness where he's going to speak. So maybe that's the question. Now, how can I get through? How can I hear what you're trying to tell me? Worship team, why don't you guys come up here? I want to challenge you. I know with a room with this many people, somebody's in one right now. You either love what I just said or really, really hate it. Man, lean into it. Lean into it. God's trying to do something in your life. Pray with me. Jesus, I don't want to thank you for the wilderness, but I do. I do because I know that's where you are and that's where you speak and that's a place you want to move, Lord. So I pray for the person right now who's in one, who they are struggling against it. Maybe they've been walking it a long time, Lord. I just pray that their heart just opens up to you, Lord, that their soul opens up to you and what you want to do in this season. I pray for all of us, Lord, that our mentality towards that wilderness would shift and that we would be open to what you're going to do. In Jesus' name I pray.